guess the thing that would be kind of important to me, and one of the reasons I wanted to come out for your sheriff's candidate, Mr. Jackson, is just to emphasize, which I think everybody in this room probably already gets it, but elections have consequences. And we're dealing with that at the federal level, but you are seeing, obviously, what I'd like to think even more people at the local level could see and act upon. And it's the office of sheriff that is just terribly, terribly important. Now, hopefully, something's going to happen across the country that's been happening here and there. For instance, Eric Cantor, you may already be forgetting that name because he's no longer in power. He was the number 2 guy in the Republican hierarchy, and a nobody political science, economics professor came out of nowhere in the Richmond, Virginia suburbs and basically, with his own bare hands, cobbled together a campaign. I think he might have ended up spending $135,000, give or take. But a lot of volunteers, a lot of effort to identify voters so that they could be contacted on multiple occasions and finally encouraged to come out and vote on election day. It's an old system. We can read Abraham Lincoln talking about it, but it works if it's actually employed at every step along the way. And so that's what David Pratt did, and now Professor David Pratt has a new first name, Congressman. And he really stunned the establishment. They didn't see it coming. Cantor was actually at a dinner at a very nice and expensive restaurant in Washington, D.C., and he got the word around, I'm not sure, maybe 7, it doesn't matter that much. He was at this fancy restaurant, some lobbyist I'm sure was going to pick up the tab, and got a message on his iPhone or whatever it might have been, and apparently his face just blanched. And he excused himself and rushed down the interstate about an hour plus away to go to his election night party, which had been billed, as every candidate would and should, as a victory party. You don't say, come to my defeat party in 2 weeks. Well, it was his defeat party. He had been beaten, and rather decisively. There was no late night counting of the vote. So out of the blue, Professor Pratt did something that hadn't been done, at least effectively, in the past by opponents that Cantor had when it happened. Pratt was able to communicate at least once with every voter with a mailing, and it just simply said, Eric Cantor says these are his positions on these many issues, but this is actually how he votes. And that was all documented with the congressional record. Date such and such, date such and such. And so people that wanted to check it out to see if this was the straight scoop, it was all there. And that absolutely took the wind out of Cantor's sails, and he never recovered. He had, excuse me, something like $10 million, and he spent a lot of it on TV and radio, but he didn't have the people. The people had been communicated with by Professor Pratt. And as a result, Eric Cantor went down to defeat. And something somewhat similar, not quite as decisive maybe, or clear, happened to Boehner. A young veteran, it looks like he might have just got out of college. Amazing. But this young veteran took on Boehner 3 years ago and got a respectable vote, got beat, but kind of surprised people that he would get even the vote that he did. So he ran again in this election cycle. And you may recall that Speaker Boehner is no longer Speaker because he actually resigned from the Congress in October. He was gone because this kid was on his heels again. And now, of course, there's many candidates in that field now that the heavy lifting's been done. But it just shows what can be done when these folks that have been in leadership have their record laid out plainly and convincingly to the voters. And particularly if they've been saying that they're conservative, and you can show a record that says, no, this is not a conservative. That can be just absolutely lethal, politically speaking. Now, one of the things that would incline me to think that it would be nice for your congressman to enjoy his very generous pension is his participation in the implementation, the funding of the entire Obama agenda. There was a fight, it wasn't much of a fight, unhappily, but there was a measure that came up that funded every single one of the various areas of government just a few months ago. And instead of fighting over it, instead of even allowing fights over various amendments, the leadership, people like Cole, just ran that thing through. And so from a Republican Congress that had campaigned that we're going to get rid of Obamacare, we'll defund it, we'll do whatever we can. Well, they lied. They did not do that. And they did have the chance, and they were confronted in the House as well as in the Senate by people like Senator Cruz, who went to the floor and engaged in an effort to force a vote, which he lost. But what makes him so unpopular and why you can get people in the Senate saying they don't like him is he made them vote. He made them make it clear to anybody that had any doubt that they might say one thing at election time, but when it came time to voting, even when the spotlight was on them, they'd grit their teeth and they'd go with the leadership, people like Cole. And so that's what's been going on in Washington. At the state level, we've actually, I think, seen more responsiveness to the, I'd like to call it the Republican revolution. There are a majority now of state legislatures, in part or totally, controlled by Republicans. They have actually been taking the initiative, and a number of states have been added to the list of those that have what we call constitutional carry, meaning no permit required to carry a concealed firearm. The latest entry to that list of all states is Maine. Maine is not noted for its conservative Republican delegation because it doesn't have one. They're all very ultra-liberal Democrats. And yet the legislature in Maine enacted and was signed by their independent governor who leans conservative, signed into law so that if you are in Maine and you've got a gun in your purse or in your pocket, that's your business. No further discussion needed. So we see this movement growing, and it's at the state level. There's been somewhat similar legislation in the Congress, but the leadership hasn't been interested in getting votes on it, which I think would result in approval if it ever did come to a vote. But the leadership seems to see most of its, or one of the important parts of its responsibility as keeping things from happening. Even though they must be intellectually aware that this is what the constituents want. And I must say, for all the years that I've worked in Washington, and now going on dangerously close to 4 decades, I really can't tell you why senators are afraid to repeat what Senator Cruz did, namely, go up to the president and say, we're not going to give you the money for this particular program or even this whole department because it's out of line, unconstitutional, the voters hate it. And the president did react, and certainly his reaction again would be, well, I'll shut the government down if you do that. And that's why I wasn't actually just passing the time of day when I commented about, well, the government has been shut down. God did it recently, and we do it every weekend, and sometimes they're in recess for weeks and even months, and it seems like the country doesn't shipwreck when the Congress is not meeting. If anything, it seems to function as well or better when they're not there as a drag on our ship of state. And so the Republicans, particularly in the Senate, are just in denial, I guess, that, wait a minute, guys, you had a shutdown over funding Zero Care or Obamacare, and you ended up getting 6 net new senators in the U.S. Senate. Now, how was that harmful to the Republican Party? Oh, no, we can't do that. We just know that it'll be an electoral disaster if we are associated with another shutdown of the government. You may have an explanation for that. I don't. It's a denial of facts that are to their favor. And I guess it's not really much of an explanation, but at least I can tell you that they seem to be so entrapped by Washington that they can't think outside that box, even when it's pretty obvious that that box isn't worth much at all. So, and in fact is likely to keep them, excuse me, as a minority if they don't continue with the flow that brought them into majority status. They could lose it pretty quickly. So I think we've got some splaining to do to these fellas, and it would seem that Mr. Cole is one that really has had trouble grasping this. There aren't that many of members of Congress, but Bridenstine stands out in Oklahoma as somebody that does get it. And he's been a very welcome addition to the ranks of those who are really trying to uphold the Constitution and bring Washington to account. And maybe we're just going to have to keep chugging along and percolating at the state level, because as these measures are advancing at the state level, we're likely to see people emerge from that process capable of taking on federal office holders and perhaps defeating them. And then finally, at the end of the process, we may see change happening in Washington. But it very much looks like now it's starting, but it's starting from below. And you guys are making it happen. And certainly if you end up this election with Sheriff Jackson, I think you're going to have sent a message, because to my knowledge, there's nobody in office as a sheriff in Oklahoma now that thinks in terms of a constitutional sheriff. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I have in mind for a constitutional sheriff. One, Billy McGee, sheriff in Forest County, Mississippi, where Hattiesburg either is in that county or nearby. And after Katrina, this Gulf Coast area was, as you I'm sure knew, was devastated. And it became very clear that the loss of electricity in many of the Gulf cities literally on the Gulf that meant without electricity, that the refrigeration in stores and pharmacies was off, and a pharmacy that doesn't have electricity pretty soon has a bunch of among other things. I don't know however many they might be, but I do know that insulin doesn't go that long without refrigeration. And so Sheriff McGee, within 2 or 3 days, heard that things were really in bad shape down on the actual coast, and he was checking with the federales, with FEMA, and they just seemed to be stuck. They weren't doing anything. And so Sheriff McGee tracked down some tractor trailers that had been assigned to deliver medicines to the coast, but he found them just sitting with their motors idling, so at least they were keeping their contents in good shape, but they weren't going anywhere, sitting in this federal compound guarded by the National Guard. So when McGee found that out, he got some of his deputies together. I don't know how many they have in Forest County, but it was enough to do what he had in mind. They weren't able to explain it successfully to the National Guardsmen guarding these 2 trucks. They were just going to let them sit there because they didn't have any orders to do anything else. And it was pretty clear that they were needed to save lives, to get those trucks moving. Well, we don't have any orders, Sheriff, so we can't do that. So Sheriff McGee told his men, take the cabs and drive them off down to the coast, and if any of the National Guardsmen try to impede you, arrest them and handcuff them. And some of them did that, and they got handcuffed and left on the ground as the trucks drove away with the medicine for the coast. Now, that was a sheriff that knew what to do. Well, the feds went bonkers. You know, what authority did he have to do that? They were going to take him into federal court. And I guess it kind of came to their attention that it might be pretty hard to get a jury verdict with people testifying that I would have died if that insulin hadn't gotten down to my pharmacy. So they ultimately found that they weren't going to be able to prosecute Sheriff McGee, and he only got reelected by something like 70% of the vote, or something like that. And so that one turned out that way. And the other example that I'd like to give you in another part of the country of a constitutional sheriff taking matters into his own hands, if that's the way it had to be done. Brad Rogers is the sheriff of Elkhart County, Indiana. It's an agricultural county. City of Elkhart's in the county. It's about 100,000 people, but most of the county is agricultural. And Sheriff Rogers was approached one day by a farmer. Interesting, he was an Amish farmer, so almost certainly he hadn't voted, therefore hadn't voted for Rogers. And he explained that the Food and Drug Administration was all over his case because he sells raw milk. And I'm not sure, I really am not sure what it is the feds have in their bonnet about raw milk, but they just go nuts about raw milk. They don't like it. And when they learned that some of his milk was being moved by co-ops across the state line into Michigan, they thought they've got him. We'll get him on a federal charge with the Food and Drug Administration. And they had been inspecting his farm, and they had him in federal court, and that's when he went to the sheriff. And he told Sheriff Rogers all the things that had been happening, and that he was afraid that if the court ruled against him, he was going to lose everything. He would be destituted, his property, all his equipment, all his cattle, everything, gone. So he said, what can you do to help me? So the sheriff went out and looked over the place. It was not the little house of horrors. There weren't dead animals stinking all over the place. It, in fact, as most dairy farms, was kind of pristine, run quite cleanly, and especially because this farmer couldn't rely on pasteurization to cover up any of his mistakes, so things were pretty good. And when Rogers was comfortable that he's not defending the indefensible, he went back to his office and communicated with the head of the legal department at the FDA and said, I just want to put you on notice that I'll arrest any more of your agents that step 1 foot on the farmer's property. And the reply came back, well, if you do that, we'll arrest you. And Sheriff Rogers, who was very low-key, very nice guy, said, game on. And that was enough, apparently, because they realized that he was actually going to stand them off, and that there might be an armed confrontation, which there very well would have been. He was serious as a heart attack. And because he was, first of all, you know, he reads the Constitution. I mean, what a drag. And he couldn't find food and drugs in the Constitution. No congressional authority, no federal authority for that. And he kind of, you know, irritating kind of guy, and he pointed that out to these poor people in the federal government, and they didn't see his point, but they did get his point when he said that he was going to arrest them. That meant he would be armed, he'd be there right on the line, and what were they going to do about it? It turned out, I checked this out, this was back in 2011. They haven't done anything. It's just sitting there. Brad Rogers, in the meantime, has been reelected by 90% of the vote, I think. Well, you can do that when you're not opposed. And so the feds really just don't have much of an opportunity to do anything at least as long as Rogers or anybody that thinks like him is sheriff of Elkhart County. So I don't know if there are any particular issues regarding the federal government here in Tulsa, but if there were something that came to a head, it'd be kind of nice to think that you could actually communicate with the feds and say, you know what, you don't have the authority to do X, Y, and Z here in Tulsa County. And when they say, says who, it'd be really very comforting to be able to say, well, the sheriff does. And I kind of think that so far, that's what they need to hear to change their plans. Because otherwise they come in like a bully and do all kinds of damage. So I think this is what this election could mean, that if you can get somebody like Jason Jackson to sit in that office, then the feds are going to know that there are limits to what they can do in Tulsa County. And that ought to be something that's a message they get to the whole country. But let it come from Tulsa. If you can't do it here in Tulsa, where in the country can we? This is a place where it wouldn't be all that unusual, hopefully, that something like that might happen. So, you know, we're riding a wave. The Republicans have been doing well. Gun sales have been going through the roof. The Second Amendment has never been as greatly exercised as it has been for the, well, really, I noticed that something was happening several weeks before the 2008 election, when a couple ladies I knew independently contacted me and said, what kind of gun should I have? And I thought, that's an interesting question that I don't usually hear. That, well, of course, for one thing, it tells you that they don't have a gun right now, and they probably, chances are, maybe have never even touched one. And so something was pushing them. Well, obviously, pretty obvious what it was. They could see that the feckless Republicans that were opposing the chosen one were likely to lose, and they were afraid that the Second Amendment would be in grave danger, and so they wanted to act. That impulse has been operating increasingly since that election. And if you've seen anything in the papers, I think the latest annual sales record was just passed just last year, and I think I'm remembering correctly, it was 18 million, which surpassed the last record the previous year of only 11 million firearms transacted at the instant background check, which means there's obviously a lot of other guns being transacted that they don't even know about, which I think is a good thing. They shouldn't know about those things. Anyway, isn't it something, just as an aside, the federal government tells us that for me to sell a .38 revolver to my neighbor is something the president has been pushing now, is something that should be of record. That we should have to go to a gun store, the dealer should have to run that instant check through Washington, actually Clarksburg, Virginia, where the computers are, and make sure it's okay with the government. This is the government that has been giving 50 caliber rifles to the Mexican cartel. Maybe you saw that when they pinched El Chapo, that in his personal collection was a 50 caliber rifle sold through the Fast and Furious program. Way to go, Barack. And so I am just super unimpressed with the need for background checks. The government can't be trusted. We're the ones that should be keeping an eye on the government, not vice versa. And I think we have a lot of work to do, but this is a time when political directions seem to be moving in our direction. We better know what our agenda is in case we make some progress in these next elections. Thanks so much for letting me come here. I don't know if you want to have time for Q&A or anything.
Tell them about your club.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I brought it up and didn't even remember it. It was supposed to jog my memory. You can see what a powerful memory I have. These are brochures that will tell you about Gun Owners of America. We lobby the Congress. Our philosophy has been, in an operational sense, one that you might say derives from the late Senator Everett Dirksen, who was fond of saying with his cigarette-stained voice, when I feel the heat, I see the light. And so we've been trying to help them see the light by getting them to feel the heat. And when our members send in email and postcards, that's the heat. That's telling them, we know what you're doing, and here's what we want you to do. Sometimes they get a little cranky about that, but that's okay. That's allowed for in our system. We're allowed to disagree, even if they don't like disagreement. It's not politically correct, I understand that, but it's still constitutional. So if you're interested in keeping a shorter lease on your member of Congress, why, here's one way to do it. Please look it over. For free, you can go online and just get our alerts, which enable you to send email to your members of Congress. So go to gunowners.org, sign up right there to get those, and be part of the solution. We've been having a lot of fun with it, and frankly, that's how we've been making the headway that we have made in the last few years. It's because of so many folks that have signed up and will take action, which doesn't take long, but it has effect. Thanks for making that.